When a cold-hearted husband abandons his terminally ill wife, believing he can escape responsibility, an unexpected twist in his father-in-law's will forces him to confront devastating secrets that could shatter his carefully constructed life. Will his quest for freedom lead to redemption or ruin? Hello family, welcome to True Life Stories. Please subscribe and leave a like for us, it means the world to us. Also share this video to your friends and loved ones and turn on post notifications so you don't miss future videos from us. Thank you as you do so. Sit back and relax as we dive into the story. In the cold, clinical atmosphere of a hospital room, where Rachel sits upright in her bed, her frail body and sunken eyes bear the marks of months of battling a terminal illness. The once vibrant artist who painted sunsets and breathed life into her surroundings now stares listlessly out the window, the gray London skies mirroring her own despair. Ethan Cooper, her husband of 7 years, stands at the foot of her bed, a picture of perfection in his tailored navy suit. His polished appearance starkly contrasts with the hollow, detached words that fall from his lips. "I'm sorry, Rachel," he says, his voice devoid of warmth or compassion. "This isn't something I can handle." His calculated tone is as sharp as a blade, cutting through the air. Rachel's trembling hands clutch the hospital blanket, her knuckles white as she tries to hold herself together. Her green eyes, now dulled by exhaustion and heartbreak, lock onto Ethan, searching for a trace of the man she once loved. Instead, she finds only cold indifference. "You're leaving me?" she whispers, her voice cracking under the weight of disbelief. Ethan adjusts his cufflinks, refusing to meet her gaze. His words are carefully measured, each one calculated to shield him from guilt. "It's not about you. It's about me. My life, my career. I can't put everything on hold." Rachel's lips quiver as she suppresses the tears threatening to spill. Her voice, though weak, carries a biting edge. "Your convenience," she says, her words slicing through Ethan's composed facade. "How could I have been so blind?" For a moment, Ethan falters. But his pride quickly reasserts itself, hardening his resolve. He tells her he has arranged for private care, as if money could mend the gaping wound his betrayal has left. "You won't want for anything," he says, his voice distant. "Except a husband," Rachel retorts, the pain in her words piercing through the sterile silence of the room. Ethan, unable to bear the weight of her accusation, turns away. The rhythmic clicking of his polished shoes on the hospital floor echoes like a drumbeat of finality. As he reaches the door, Rachel musters her strength for one last attempt to reach him. "Ethan," she calls, her voice frail but resolute. He hesitates, his back still turned to her, but he doesn't respond. The door closes behind him, leaving Rachel alone with her pain and the haunting sound of the heart monitor beeping steadily in the background. There left a poignant image of a woman abandoned at her most vulnerable and a man walking away, blind to the consequences of his actions. The scene sets the emotional tone of the story and foreshadows the struggles and revelations that lie ahead. Rachel lay in her hospital bed, the sterile white walls around her seeming to close in like a prison. The mechanical hum of the heart monitor filled the silence, a cruel reminder of the fragility of her existence. As she stared at the ceiling, her mind wandered back to a time when life felt full of promise, love, and hope, a stark contrast to the emptiness Ethan's departure had left behind. Rachel's thoughts drifted to the day she and Ethan met at an art gallery opening in the heart of London. He had been charming, attentive, and enamored with her vibrant spirit and passion for art. She could still hear his voice, warm and filled with admiration, as he spoke of how her paintings seemed to capture emotions that words could not. Back then, his sharp suits and air of confidence had seemed alluring, not intimidating. She remembered their spontaneous late-night conversations, their shared dreams of a future filled with love and adventure. But as her illness progressed, those memories became bittersweet, tainted by the cold reality of Ethan's abandonment. The man who once swore to stand by her in sickness and in health had shown that his vows were nothing more than hollow words. Meanwhile, Ethan walked briskly through the streets of London, his mind racing as he tried to justify his actions. He had told himself that his decision to leave Rachel was logical, a necessary step to preserve his career and sanity. He couldn't bear the weight of watching her decline, the sleepless nights, or the guilt of knowing there was nothing he could do to stop her suffering. "She'll be better off with professionals," he muttered to himself, ignoring the gnawing doubt creeping into his thoughts. He had always prided himself on being practical, someone who made decisions with his head, not his heart. But why, then, did the image of Rachel's teary, accusing eyes refuse to leave him? Ethan's thoughts briefly shifted to his childhood. His father, a stoic and unyielding man, had drilled into him the belief that emotions were a weakness. "Focus on yourself, Ethan. No one else will," his father used to say. It was a lesson Ethan had embraced, shaping his life around self-reliance and ambition. But now, in the quiet moments between meetings and deals, he wondered if that philosophy had left him hollow. Rachel's memories of Ethan's warmth and charm faded, replaced by the cold reality of his transformation. His ambition, once a trait she admired, had slowly overshadowed every other part of his personality. She had noticed it in the little things. The way he grew impatient with her stories, the way he prioritized his work over their plans, and the way he stopped looking at her, as if she were the most beautiful thing in the world. Lying alone in her hospital room, Rachel couldn't help but wonder if she had ever truly known Ethan, or if she had been in love with the version of him she had wanted to see. Ethan returns to his pristine apartment, surrounded by the trappings of success: sleek furniture, expensive artwork, and a view of the London skyline. But the space feels emptier than usual. He pours himself a glass of whiskey, staring at the amber liquid as if it holds the answers he seeks. Rachel, meanwhile, clutches a sketchbook, her frail hands struggling to hold the pencil steady. She begins to draw, her lines tentative but purposeful. The act of creating, even in her weakened state, gives her a sense of control, a glimmer of hope amid the darkness. In their separate worlds, both Ethan and Rachel are haunted by the echoes of their shared past. While Rachel finds solace in her art, Ethan is left grappling with a question he cannot ignore. Has his relentless pursuit of success come at the cost of his humanity? Ethan, sitting in the oak-paneled office of his late father-in-law's attorney, a room steeped in an air of formality and authority. Sunlight streams through tall windows, casting long shadows across the polished mahogany table. Ethan adjusts his cufflinks, his expression composed, though beneath the surface, anticipation hums like a taut string. He's convinced this meeting will affirm his belief that walking away from Rachel was the right decision, a step toward a future free of burdens. Seated across from him, the family attorney, Mr. Barrington, a gray-haired man with sharp eyes, meticulously unfolds a thick document. His deliberate manner irritates Ethan, whose impatience grows with every passing second. Finally, Mr. Barrington clears his throat and begins. "Mr. Cooper," the attorney says, peering over his glasses, "your late father-in-law, Mr. William Smith, was a man of significant means and foresight. His will outlines a number of provisions, including one that pertains directly to you." Ethan leans forward slightly, masking his eagerness behind a veneer of indifference. He fully expects to hear about a substantial inheritance, a payout that will validate his decision to leave Rachel. As per Mr. Smith's wishes, Mr. Barrington continues, a large portion of his estate, including financial assets, properties, and investments, is to be held in trust. The conditions for releasing these assets, however, are contingent upon your continued care and support of his daughter, Rachel. Ethan's calm demeanor falters. "Excuse me," he says, his voice edged with disbelief. The attorney explains further. "Mr. Smith's will stipulates that you must remain actively involved in Rachel's life, ensuring her well-being for the remainder of her illness. Failure to do so will result in the forfeiture of your claim to the estate." Ethan's mind races, his thoughts a whirlwind of anger and disbelief. How could William Smith, a man who had always respected Ethan's business acumen, tie his wealth to something so irrational? The conditions felt like a trap, forcing him to choose between his ambition and a responsibility he had willingly abandoned. As the attorney drones on about legal specifics, Ethan's frustration boils over. He interrupts, his voice sharp. "This is absurd. Rachel is already receiving the best care money can buy. Surely that satisfies the conditions." Mr. Barrington shakes his head. "The terms require your personal involvement, Mr. Cooper. Financial provisions are insufficient." Ethan's hands clench into fists beneath the table. He had walked away to preserve his life's trajectory, not to be dragged back into Rachel's world of hospitals, treatments, and emotional turmoil. Yet the wealth William Smith had left behind could open doors Ethan had only dreamed of. Was it worth sacrificing his pride and independence? As the meeting concludes, Mr. Barrington hands Ethan a sealed envelope. "Your father-in-law instructed me to deliver this letter to you personally. Perhaps it will provide clarity." Back in his sleek apartment, Ethan pours himself a drink and opens the envelope with a mix of curiosity and dread. The letter is brief but piercing. "Ethan, I've always seen through your charm, your ambition, and your veneer of control. You think life is about winning, about reaching the top at any cost. But you've overlooked the most important lesson. Life's true worth lies in the people we love and the sacrifices we make for them. This inheritance is not a reward, it's a test. Prove to me that you understand what matters before it's too late. William. The words hit Ethan harder than he expects, striking at the core of his carefully constructed identity. For the first time, he begins to wonder if William's words carry a truth he has long ignored. Meanwhile, Rachel remains unaware of the drama unfolding around her father's will. She spends her days in quiet reflection, drawing in her sketchbook and finding small moments of solace. Her strength, though waning physically, is unyielding in spirit. A nurse enters her room with a bouquet of flowers, lilies, her favorite. She assumes they're from the hospital staff until she spots the card. Rachel, I'll see you soon. Ethan. Her heart tightens. What could he possibly want now? The chapter ends with Ethan standing at the window of his apartment, staring out at the glittering London skyline. In his hand is William's letter, its words echoing in his mind. He knows he has a decision to make. Continue his pursuit of wealth and freedom, or step into the role William demands of him. A role that forces him to face Rachel, her pain, and the parts of himself he'd rather ignore. The weight of his choice looms heavy, setting the stage for the moral and emotional journey ahead. Ethan sat in the back seat of his sleek black car, staring out at the passing cityscape. The driver navigated through the crowded streets, but Ethan hardly noticed. His mind was consumed by the ultimatum his father-in-law's will had delivered. On one hand, the inheritance represented the pinnacle of his ambitions: wealth, influence, and the ability to expand his already successful career. On the other, it meant entangling himself with Rachel, the woman he had abandoned, and confronting the guilt he had tried so hard to suppress. Ethan's decision to visit Rachel wasn't born of sudden compassion or remorse. He saw it as a strategic move, a means to secure the inheritance without truly engaging in the emotional toll of her illness. A few visits, a few empty gestures, and I'll be free of this, he thought, convincing himself it was the most logical course of action. As he entered the hospital, the sterile smell of antiseptic and the muted hum of machinery hit him like a wave. Memories of his last visit flooded back: Rachel's frail frame, her hauntingly dull green eyes, and the pain etched across her face. He pushed the thoughts aside, focusing on the task at hand. When he stepped into Rachel's room, she looked up, surprise flickering across her face. "Ethan," she said softly, her voice tinged with both disbelief and wariness. "I thought I'd check on you," he said, his tone carefully neutral. Rachel studied him for a long moment, her artist's eyes noticing the tension in his jaw, the stiffness in his posture. "Why now?" she asked, her voice steady despite her obvious fatigue. Ethan hesitated, the truth lodged in his throat. Instead, he offered a vague excuse about wanting to ensure she was comfortable and well cared for. Rachel didn't press further, but the skepticism in her gaze spoke volumes. Over the next few days, Ethan made an effort to fulfill the will's conditions. He attended Rachel's doctor appointments, listened to her medical updates, and even brought her flowers on one occasion. But his actions felt hollow, his presence perfunctory rather than genuine. Rachel, too weak to argue, observed his behavior with quiet resignation. She saw through his facade, recognizing the guilt and discomfort he tried so hard to mask. Yet she also glimpsed something deeper, flickers of vulnerability that hinted at the man he used to be. One afternoon, while Ethan sat silently in her hospital room scrolling through emails, Rachel spoke up. "Do you remember when we used to dream about traveling the world?" Ethan looked up, startled. "Of course," he replied, though the memory felt distant, like a relic from another life. "I painted a mural of all the places we talked about," Rachel said. "It's in the attic at home. You probably haven't seen it in years." Her words struck a nerve. Ethan had buried those memories, much like he had buried the parts of himself that once cared deeply for her. During one of Ethan's meetings with Mr. Barrington, the attorney delivered a sobering reminder. "Mr. Cooper," he said, folding his hands on the desk, "the conditions of the will are not about mere appearances. If at any point it becomes clear that your involvement is insincere, the trust will be dissolved." Mr. Smith made that explicitly clear. Ethan's frustration bubbled beneath the surface. "And who decides if I'm sincere enough?" "Rachel." "Ultimately, yes," Mr. Barrington replied. "Her testimony will weigh heavily in determining whether you've fulfilled your obligations." Ethan left the office feeling trapped, the burden of his choices pressing down on him like a vice. Back in her hospital room, Rachel continued to draw in her sketchbook, pouring her emotions into her art. One evening, Ethan noticed her working on a piece, a delicate pencil sketch of a tree with branches that seemed to reach endlessly into the sky. "What's that?" he asked, his curiosity genuine for the first time. Rachel didn't look up. "A tree of second chances," she said simply. Ethan frowned. "Second chances? It's what my dad used to say," she explained. "That everyone deserves one. But only if they're willing to work for it." Her words lingered in Ethan's mind long after he left the hospital that night. For the first time, he wondered if his involvement with Rachel could be more than a means to an end. Ethan went back to his apartment, staring at Rachel's sketch, which he had taken with him. The intricate details of the tree, the way its branches intertwined, the strength of its roots, spoke to him in a way he couldn't quite explain. As he placed the sketch on his desk, he felt an unfamiliar sensation: doubt. Doubt about his motives, doubt about his choices, and doubt about the man he had become. For the first time, he questioned whether the true burden wasn't the will's conditions, but his own inability to face the emotions he had suppressed for so long. This chapter marks a turning point for Ethan, as the cracks in his calculated persona begin to deepen, and he starts to grapple with the possibility of genuine change. Ethan sat in Rachel's hospital room, the antiseptic smell and rhythmic beeping of machines filling the silence. His initial visits had been stiff and transactional, but today, something felt different. Rachel, though visibly weaker, had a quiet resolve in her demeanor that Ethan couldn't ignore. Her resilience gnawed at the carefully constructed walls he'd built around his emotions. For the first time, Ethan felt out of place not because of the hospital's sterility, but because of the emptiness in his own heart. As Ethan scrolled through his phone, Rachel broke the silence. "Why are you really here, Ethan?" she asked, her voice soft but firm. Ethan hesitated, caught off guard by her directness. "I told you. I wanted to make sure you're okay." Rachel tilted her head, her green eyes piercing through his facade. "You've never been one for charity. There's something else, isn't there?" Ethan's grip on his phone tightened. For a moment, he considered lying, but Rachel's steady gaze disarmed him. "It's about your father's will," he admitted reluctantly. "There's a clause about me needing to support you to inherit his estate." Rachel's expression didn't change, but the faintest flicker of pain crossed her eyes. "I see," she said quietly. "I didn't mean for it to sound so transactional," Ethan added hastily. Rachel gave him a small, sad smile. "But it is, isn't it? You're here for him, not me." Her words cut deeper than Ethan anticipated. For the first time, he felt the weight of her disappointment, and it unsettled him in ways he couldn't articulate. Over the following days, Ethan began to notice the small, human moments he had ignored before. The way Rachel winced when the nurse adjusted her the quiet strength she displayed during physical therapy, and the way her hands trembled when she tried to sketch. He watched her fight battles he couldn't comprehend, her courage forcing him to confront his own cowardice. One evening, he arrived at the hospital to find Rachel in tears, her sketchbook lying on the floor. He picked it up and handed it to her, unsure of what to say. "What's wrong?" he asked, his voice uncharacteristically gentle. "My hands," Rachel whispered, staring at them as if they belonged to someone else. "They don't listen to me anymore. I can't even draw a straight line." Ethan felt an unfamiliar pang of empathy. He sat beside her, uncharacteristically vulnerable. "I'm sorry," he said, the words awkward but sincere. Rachel looked at him, surprised by the crack in his usually stoic demeanor. "Thank you," she murmured. One afternoon, Rachel asked Ethan to take her outside to the hospital garden. Though hesitant, he agreed, wheeling her to a quiet spot beneath a sprawling oak tree. For a while, neither of them spoke, the silence filled by the rustling of leaves and the distant chirping of birds. "Do you remember our first trip to Paris?" Rachel asked suddenly. Ethan nodded. "You spent hours sketching the Eiffel Tower while I complained about missing a meeting." Rachel chuckled softly. "You were so annoyed with me. But later, you surprised me with that dinner cruise on the Seine. I still think about that night." Ethan smiled faintly, the memory stirring something long buried within him. "I thought you'd forgotten about that." "I haven't forgotten anything," Rachel said, her voice tinged with both nostalgia and sadness. "Not even the man you used to be." Her words struck a nerve, leaving Ethan to grapple with a truth he had tried to ignore. The man Rachel remembered was someone he had lost along the way. That night, Ethan returned home to his pristine apartment, the emptiness of the space amplifying the turmoil in his mind. He poured himself a drink and stared at Rachel's latest sketch, which he had taken from the hospital with her permission. It was unfinished, a depiction of the hospital garden, but the lines were shaky, the strokes hesitant. For the first time, Ethan saw more than just Rachel's struggle. He saw his own. He had spent years chasing success, building walls around himself to keep others out. But those same walls now felt suffocating, isolating him from the very things that gave life meaning. Ethan's mind wandered to William Smith's letter. Life's true worth lies in the people we love and the sacrifices we make for them. He had dismissed those words as sentimental nonsense, but now they haunted him. Ethan began to question his motives. Was he only here for the inheritance, or was there a chance to rebuild something with Rachel? To redeem himself? The thought scared him. Redemption required vulnerability, and vulnerability was a luxury Ethan had long forsaken. The chapter ends with Ethan standing on the precipice of change, torn between his old ways and the possibility of becoming the man Rachel once believed he could be. His journey is no longer just about fulfilling the conditions of the will. It's about confronting the emptiness within himself and discovering whether he has the courage to change. Ethan sat in his car outside the hospital, gripping the steering wheel tightly. The usual confidence he wore like armor felt cracked and brittle. Rachel's words, her quiet strength, and her refusal to break under the weight of her illness haunted him. For the first time in years, he questioned whether his relentless pursuit of success had come at the cost of his soul. But doubt wasn't enough to rewrite years of selfishness. Ethan was torn between two paths, one that required humility, sacrifice, and confronting his deepest fears, and another that allowed him to return to the cold, comfortable solitude of his old life. Inside the hospital, Rachel's condition had taken a turn for the worse. Her energy waned, and even her sketching, a lifeline through her illness, became too taxing. The nurses whispered about her decline, their concerned glances fueling Ethan's growing sense of guilt. One day, Rachel woke to find Ethan sitting by her bedside, a rare expression of vulnerability etched across his face. "You're here early," she said weakly, her voice barely above a whisper. Ethan nodded. "I thought I'd bring you something." He held up a wrapped package, fumbling slightly as he handed it to her. Rachel opened it to reveal a new set of sketching pencils and a leather-bound sketchbook. She ran her fingers over the smooth cover, her eyes glistening with emotion. "I don't know if I can use them," she admitted. "Maybe not now," Ethan said, his voice soft, "but when you're ready." The small gesture, though simple, struck a chord with Rachel. For the first time, Ethan's actions seemed unmotivated by obligation, and it made her wonder if the man she once loved was still buried beneath the layers of ambition and detachment. Later that evening, Ethan found himself sitting in Rachel's hospital room, flipping through her old sketchbook. Each page told a story, a memory of places they had visited, dreams they had shared, and moments of joy that now felt like fragments of another life. As he reached the final pages, he stopped at a sketch of two hands intertwined, drawn with an intimacy and tenderness that felt like a mirror reflecting what they had lost. Below the sketch were the words, "Love is the only thing worth fighting for." The weight of those words settled over Ethan like a lead blanket. He had spent his entire life fighting for wealth, status, and control, but none of it had brought him the fulfillment Rachel had captured so effortlessly in her art. The next day, Rachel suffered a medical emergency. Alarms blared as nurses and doctors rushed into her room. Ethan stood frozen in the hallway, watching helplessly as the team worked to stabilize her. The reality of losing Rachel hit him like a tidal wave. The thought of her absence, a permanent void where her strength, humor, and quiet resilience had once been, terrified him in a way he hadn't anticipated. When the chaos subsided, a doctor approached him. "She's stable for now, but her condition is critical. We're doing everything we can." Ethan nodded, his throat tight with emotion. For the first time in years, he prayed. Not for the inheritance, not for himself, but for Rachel. Ethan spent the night in the hospital, unable to leave Rachel's side. As she slept, he replayed their life together in his mind. The laughter, the arguments, the love that had once felt unshakable. He thought of William Smith's words, the will, and the test it represented. But now, the inheritance felt secondary. This wasn't about money or proving himself to anyone. This was about Rachel, the woman he had once vowed to love and protect, the woman he had betrayed, and the woman who still, despite everything, had the power to inspire him to be better. The next morning, Rachel woke to find Ethan holding her hand. She blinked in surprise, her voice hoarse. "You stayed?" Ethan nodded, his eyes red-rimmed but resolute. "I'm done running, Rachel. I don't know if I can fix everything, but I want to try. For you. For us. Rachel studied him, her expression unreadable. It's not that simple, Ethan. You can't just decide to care when it's convenient. I know, Ethan said, his voice trembling. But I'm not doing this for the inheritance anymore. I'm doing this because I can't stand the thought of losing you without trying to make things right. The chapter ends with Rachel offering a faint but genuine smile. We'll see, she said softly. Ethan knew her forgiveness wouldn't come easily, nor should it. But for the first time in years, he felt a flicker of hope. A chance to rebuild what he had broken, not just with Rachel, but within himself. As he looked out the hospital window at the rising sun, Ethan realized that redemption wasn't about a single act but a commitment to change, one step at a time. And in that moment, he resolved to take those steps, no matter how long or difficult the journey might be. This chapter serves as the emotional climax of the story, with Ethan facing the consequences of his past and taking the first genuine steps toward redemption, setting the stage for the resolution of his journey. Ethan stood in the dimly lit attic of the home he and Rachel had once shared. Dust motes floated in the air, illuminated by a single shaft of sunlight filtering through a cracked window. The space was cluttered with remnants of their life together. Old suitcases, forgotten trinkets, and stacks of Rachel's artwork. It was a place he hadn't set foot in for years, a space he had deliberately avoided. But now, driven by something he couldn't quite name, Ethan had returned. He carefully pulled out a large canvas wrapped in protective cloth, unveiling Rachel's mural. A vivid depiction of places they had once dreamed of visiting. The Eiffel Tower, the Taj Mahal, the Serengeti, and the Great Wall of China, all rendered with Rachel's signature blend of realism and whimsy. As Ethan ran his fingers over the painted surface, he felt a pang of regret. The mural wasn't just art. It was a testament to the life they had envisioned together, a life he had let slip away. In the corner of the attic, Ethan spotted an old wooden chest with Rachel's father's initials carved into the lid. Curious, he pried it open and found a bundle of letters tied with a silk ribbon. Each envelope was addressed to Rachel, but one was marked with his name. Ethan hesitated, then unfolded the letter. Ethan, if you're reading this, it means you've chosen to face what you've been running from. I always saw potential in you, but I also saw the fear that held you back, the fear of failure, of vulnerability, of not being enough. Rachel is my greatest treasure, and when you married her, I believed you could be the man she needed. But life has a way of testing us, doesn't it? The inheritance I've left is not just wealth. It's a lesson. If you've truly learned it, then you'll understand that love, sacrifice, and connection are the only things that give life meaning. Wealth without purpose is a hollow victory. I hope you prove me right, Ethan. Not for the money, but for Rachel, and for yourself. William Smith. Ethan sank to the floor, the letter trembling in his hands. For the first time, he realized that William's test wasn't a punishment, but a gift. A chance to reclaim the man he had lost and the life he had abandoned. Back at the hospital, Rachel had grown weaker. The once vivid spark in her eyes had dimmed, and even her voice carried the weight of exhaustion. Yet she continued to sketch, creating small, incomplete drawings in her notebook whenever her strength allowed. One evening, Ethan sat by her bedside, watching her struggle with a pencil that shook in her unsteady hand. "Let me help," he said softly, reaching for the pencil. Rachel hesitated, then handed it to him. "You draw?" she asked with a faint smile. Ethan chuckled nervously. "I'm no artist, but I can try." Together, they worked on a simple drawing of a tree. Rachel guided him, her instructions clear but gentle, and Ethan followed, his movements clumsy but earnest. The final product was far from perfect, but it was theirs, a collaboration that symbolized a tentative rebuilding of their bond. As they worked, Rachel began to open up, sharing memories of her father and the lessons he had taught her. She spoke of his unwavering belief in second chances and his insistence that people could change if they were willing to put in the effort. "He believed in you, Ethan," Rachel said, her voice steady despite her fatigue. "Even when I couldn't." Her words hit Ethan like a tidal wave. "I'm sorry," he whispered, his voice breaking. "For everything, for leaving, for hurting you, for not being the man you needed." Rachel placed her hand over his. "I'm not saying I've forgiven you," she said, "but I can see that you're trying. That means something." Inspired by William's letter and Rachel's quiet strength, Ethan resolved to make amends. Not just with Rachel, but with the parts of himself he had neglected. He reached out to people he had alienated in his pursuit of success, reconnected with old friends, and even began volunteering at the hospital, offering support to families going through similar struggles. In the process, Ethan discovered a sense of fulfillment that no amount of wealth or career achievements had ever given him. The inheritance, once his sole focus, became an afterthought. What mattered now was Rachel, their shared memories, and the opportunity to create new ones, even if time was running out. One evening, Rachel handed Ethan a sealed envelope. "It's from my dad," she said. "He asked me to give it to you when I thought you were ready." Ethan opened the letter with trembling hands. "Ethan, if you've made it this far, then I trust you've learned what I wanted you to understand. You always had the potential to be more than you allowed yourself to be. I'm proud of the man you're becoming, and I hope Rachel is too. Remember, the greatest inheritance isn't what I've left in trust. It's the love you share with her and the legacy you'll build together. Take care of her, Ethan. She's worth it. William Smith." Tears streamed down Ethan's face as he folded the letter. He looked at Rachel, who smiled faintly, her hand reaching for his. "We'll figure this out," Ethan said, his voice steady with determination. "We will," Rachel replied, her eyes shining with a mixture of hope and trust. Ethan, who was standing at the threshold of Rachel's hospital room, his once confident demeanor now replaced by vulnerability. The echoes of his past mistakes reverberate in his mind as he clutches a worn journal, a collection of letters and sketches Rachel's father left behind. The journal, which has served as his guide to understanding the depth of Rachel's pain and her father's wisdom, is now his compass for redemption. Rachel lies frail but serene, her strength no longer physical but emotional. Ethan hesitates before entering, knowing that his actions have deeply wounded her. When Rachel looks up and sees him, her expression is unreadable, a mix of surprise, caution, and a flicker of the love they once shared. Ethan begins with a heartfelt apology, his voice breaking as he recounts the moments that led to his selfish decisions. He acknowledges the pain he caused and expresses his regret, not only for abandoning her, but for failing to honor the love and partnership they once promised each other. He hands her the journal, explaining how it revealed a side of her father he never understood, a man who valued loyalty, love, and resilience above all else. Rachel listens silently, her gaze piercing as she evaluates his sincerity. Ethan reveals his decision to reject the inheritance entirely, knowing that no amount of money could ever make up for what he had done. Instead, he commits himself to Rachel, not out of obligation or guilt, but because he now understands the value of true connection and the depth of his feelings for her. He vows to support her in whatever time they have left, whether she forgives him or not. The turning point comes when Rachel reaches for the journal. As she flips through the pages, tears well up in her eyes. She shares memories of her father, his unwavering belief in second chances, and his faith in people's capacity to change. Ethan's transformation seems genuine, but Rachel's forgiveness is not instant. It is a journey, just as his redemption has been. In the final scene, Rachel offers Ethan a small, tentative smile, a glimmer of hope. They agree to take things one day at a time, rebuilding trust and rediscovering the bond they once shared. Ethan begins to care for Rachel with humility and devotion, realizing that this act of love is the true legacy her father intended to leave behind. The story ends with Rachel and Ethan sitting by a window, sunlight streaming in, as they share a quiet moment of peace. The future remains uncertain, but for the first time in a long while, it holds the promise of healing and a second chance at love. We have come to the end of this beautiful story. Thank you for watching. Until my next video, stay safe.